Welcome back. Before I will represent today's second keynote speaker, I would like to make the following announcements for the participants who just joined. For English or Turkish interpreting, there is a button at the bottom of the screen. For English, please click on English. For Turkish, please click on Korean. And now our second keynote speaker is Associate Professor Daniel King, joining us from Australia, works at Flinders University. He will deliver a presentation titled Predatory Monetisation in Online Games. Mr. King, welcome.
Thank you.
Do you hear me? Yes, I can hear you and I also see you perfectly. Welcome to our Congress. It's a big privilege to see you here, sir.
Thank you.
Now, I leave the floor to Dr. Daniel King.
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to join you for this International Congress on Technology Addiction. And I want to say thank you to the Green Crescent Society for this great honour and pleasure to talk to you about predatory monetisation in online games. I had the good fortune of being in Istanbul in 2017 and making a wish at the Hen's Eye column. And I don't remember what I wished for, but I can tell you what I wish for you to know by the end of this talk. So I want to begin with a summary of some of the key points that I'll be making in this keynote. The first is that in-game spending is increasingly common across many games, including many forms of mobile games, but also it's not limited just to those types. It's also across a great variety of video games. Some in-game purchasing offers and opportunities can be considered predatory in nature, and I'll explain what I mean by predatory monetisation. Some of these new in-game spending opportunities can resemble and also enable some new forms of gambling. However, a lot of in-game monetisation systems can also be quite different to and much more complex than gambling mechanics. And there's growing research that suggests that there are some correlational links between spending on games like microtransactions and loot boxes and indicators of problem gambling and gaming. And I think in some cases we should be taking into consideration in-game spending when we conceptualise problem gaming and gaming disorder. So that's what I'd like to cover in this presentation. So the video game industry, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry that's grown and changed a lot over its history. It used to be limited to arcade machines or console and PC games, but the most significant change in online gaming in the last 5 to 10 years has been the monumental increase in mobile gaming. It represents most of the revenue that the gaming industry makes. It's through mobile games. And many of these games make their money through in-game purchasing. We've also seen in the last year to 18 months through the current pandemic that gaming has increased in terms of its uptake and participation and spending quite substantially. Some game subscription services like Steam, for example, have recorded a 70% increase in the number of subscribers. So the effect of the pandemic on gaming has led to, I think, a general increase across a number of sectors. And this can be attributable to the stay-at-home lifestyles and that are related to the pandemic. We've also seen a lot of changes in the underlying technologies for many online games. We've seen changes in the audio and noise cancelling technologies, making these sorts of products more immersive, changes in the screens and resolution of games that enable a greater sense of presence or being there, and more visual effects. Augmented reality is another major development that's continuing to grow, as is virtual reality and its related peripherals, which give players a sense of total immersion in the game. The design of games has also changed a lot over time, and something that I've noticed across a number of online games is that they are designed in such a way for players to make very steady progress very quickly in the initial stages of the game, but then for those same requirements to make progress to increase dramatically as the player makes more progress through the game. So games have often escalating time commitment, and that has a lot of implications for the microtransactions within those games. That there might be certain paywalls, as they're called, where the game developer might say to the player, would you like to make progress more quickly? You can skip some of these parts if you pay money. So games in general are quite diverse. There's not really any one single type of game. There's sort of thousands of different games, and there's been a great hybridisation of games where you have sports games and shooting games and many other types of games that are incorporating more complex progression systems and rewards, much like role-playing games. So we see that many games now have role-playing elements where a player would come in and create a character and have to make some progress through the game as that character. And the consequence of that has been that many game developers have taken these very sophisticated RPG or role-playing game elements and found ways to monetize them, to make people spend money. And it might be things like buying something new for your character, or unlocking a new weapon or a new item, or giving your character a competitive advantage. And a lot of these monetization systems have led to some observations that in some ways games are looking very similar to gambling because of the critical ingredient of randomness that is often associated with microtransactions. And here I have a picture of the loot box, which appears in many different implementations in different games. And an analysis of the top 100 games on Facebook a few years ago identified that over half of these games, or around half of these games, actually contain many gambling elements. And actually many of them were also owned and developed by the gambling operators. So gambling operators are looking at mobile games as a way of creating game-like versions of their casino products and promoting their services and venues. And similarly, we see top 100 games on Google Play and Apple Games, about 6 in 10 of these games in a recent analysis in 2020, saying that these are quite prevalent, and many of these are rated as suitable for children. And I want to highlight too that with microtransactions, there is this assumption that they are micro, that they are small, but that's not necessarily always the case. As you can see here, often players will be presented with a purchasing offer that is often more expensive than a full retail game. So microtransactions are not always micro. Another feature of monetized items in online games is that they can establish economies that exist outside of the game. And one example of this is skins that you see here, where players are able to purchase virtual items inside the game and then use those virtual items as a form of currency, often for the purpose of betting or playing games of chance. So in this way, we see that some of these monetized games are enabling gambling. Sometimes a game is developed with monetization in mind within its structure, but we also see games that have monetization features added after they've been developed. And this is an example of a basketball game that added slot machines to the game on certain items. And a recent survey of players of online, massively multiplayer online games found that the majority of these players were spending some money, and they often felt that they had to spend money in order to stay competitive with their peers. With millions of people spending money on online games, it's no surprise then that some players are spending excessively. And there's been some reports in the media about players who are spending tens of thousands of dollars. This player spent $62,000 on RuneScape. Here we have another player who spent over $150,000 on microtransactions in a mobile game. Another who spent $400,000, and even one person who spent over $2 million on a mobile game. And it's not limited to adults. There's also been cases of younger people, teenagers, who spent many thousands of dollars, often using their parents' credit card to rack up very large debts on microtransactions. And in the American the American Journal of Addictions, there was a case of a 50-year-old patient with a number of psychological vulnerabilities who was seen who had spent nearly half of his income on microtransactions on his smartphone. So we're starting to see these cases coming into clinical settings. And here's another example from the Kurihama Medical and Addiction Treatment Center in Yokohama in Japan, presented here by Professor Susumu Higuchi, of a fellow who was spending twice his annual income, over 60,000 US a year, on microtransactions within the game. So this leads to some observations. We're seeing gaming companies are testing many different implementations of monetisation. We're not just seeing people paying, pay per play or purchasing a game outright or just subscriptions. We're seeing a lot of microtransactions. And many of these developers would like players to equate monetisation with fun or enjoyment in the game. And many of these services are often quite dynamic. So the game can change at any time. The value and function of the microtransaction can be changed by the developer at any time. And it's for that reason that loot boxes are beginning to attract stronger regulation. And we're starting to see that across Europe and other places. Which leads us to the question, if we're talking about regulation, are monetised games the same, or are they just similar to gambling? And it really depends on the implementation. If we're talking about games, there's no real clear definition of a game, but rather there's principles of game design. Games tend to be interactive activities. They tend to involve a great deal of decision-making and strategy. They reward players for correct behaviour with rewards or other on-screen indicators of success. And in general, a good player will win, whereas bad players will lose. And that's because good players tend to have more skill, make sounder decisions, have quicker reflexes, and there's a little bit of luck involved too. So in traditional games, we would say that players develop mastery of the game through practice, through greater knowledge of the games, sharing their strategies, through trial and error, and memorization. This is what traditionally we would expect from a game, from a successful game player. Gambling, on the other hand, has a very different set of criteria or definitional criteria. We're talking about an activity where the player will have to risk something of value on an outcome that's determined solely or primarily chance, and will receive something of value in the event of a certain outcome. And when we look at some of the games that have been published over the last few years, the most popular games, this analysis by Drummond and Sawyer in 2018 found that many of these games actually meet many of the classic criteria for gambling. They also meet the criteria for games, but they also include many gambling criteria. Studies that have looked at the motivations for spending in games, trying to make sense of why do people spend money on these activities when there's rarely any opportunity to make money back. It's not only just about the rewards or the competitive advantages. That's not why people are always spending money. Microtransaction spending is also emotion-driven for some people. It's about coping with difficult feelings or managing their distress. It's also highly socially influenced. So players who want to keep up with what their friends are doing, or they feel the pressure to keep up with what their friends are purchasing. But also we know that microtransaction spending is related to impulsivity. People often make decisions quite quickly without regard to the consequences of those purchasing decisions. So how do these otherwise free online games encourage people to spend money? What are some of the strategies that these games are using to get people to spend? In 2018, Paul Del Fabro and myself developed this definition of predatory monetisation. And we're talking about in-game purchasing systems that disguise or withhold the true long-term cost of the activity until players are already financially and or psychologically committed. And we're talking about the schemes in these games that are designed to encourage repeated player spending using certain tactics or elements that include things like not giving the player very much information about the product or the value and function of microtransactions. This might be something like once you start playing the game, you're immediately encouraged to spend money. Usually with the information that this will be a very good deal, this is a bargain, it's very popular, without really knowing why or how that purchase will affect the game going forward. Games also that use these tactics will sometimes mislead about the chances of winning certain things. They will constantly and intrusively and unavoidably hit you with purchasing offers. And they will also manipulate outcomes in the game according to certain characteristics of the user to reinforce continuous play. And fundamentally, when we're talking about predatory monetisation schemes, we're talking about schemes that are exploiting the inequalities in information between the purchaser and the provider. So the industry is using knowledge about specific players, what their preferences are, how much money they have, what their habits tend to be, and then using that information, leveraging that information to give you offers that are predetermined to maximise the likelihood that you'll spend money. If they know what you like, they can give you that over and over again. And we looked at this in some of the utility patents that had been filed as intellectual property by some of these online game providers. But before I show you some of these, I want to just reinforce this notion of information asymmetry. So in traditional games, the player, as they make progress through the game, they learn more about the game, they have more strategy that they know works. And so the player has more information about the game than they did when they began. In many of these microtransaction-based games or monetised games, as the player spends more time in the activity, they're actually giving more information to the game developer, the seller, to then exploit that information to optimize offers to the player. So here are some of the patents that we've identified about the financial aspects of microtransactions. The first is a patent that refers to prices of items in a microtransaction-based game that depend on how much money you've already spent. So in this way, the developer is able to individually tailor the prices of items to maximise the player's spending. This is another one where in the game, the likelihood of certain rewards are adjusted based on how much money the player has already spent and how much credit the player has. So it gives the provider the opportunity to exploit the big spenders in that game. And here's another one where a system matches players who have certain preferences for items with other players who have already purchased those items so that they're exposed to those items more frequently. And through mere exposure, they might be more likely to buy those things because they're always seeing other people using them. Another important development has been game companies that have developed hybrid gaming gambling activities. And this is one example, Synergy Blue, that have a game service where their motto is that they create fun you can bet on. And they filed over 200 patents. And I want to give you an example. Now, it's quite complicated on the screen, but really I just want to draw your attention to the tracking parameters that are described within this patent. And the game is all about tracking the players' betting activities, their preferences, taking into account all of the data that they have about the player. and then using that information to give games that that are selected based on how much money they're paying out, or games that are likely to take the most money from players, and games that tend to attract the highest wages among players. So these are very sophisticated systems that are designed to essentially get players to spend as much money as they can. And psychologically, we're talking about two different types of systems working together. Game systems that are increasing the amount of time that a player might spend in an activity, which has this psychological effect of cognitive dissonance, where the player has to rationalize to themselves why they're spending so much time. And the obvious answer is that they like it. And if you like it, you're going to justify continued playing. And the second type of game system is one that requires spending in order to play. And this has the effect of endowment, where we know from behavioral economics that people who spend money on anything are more likely to attribute more personal value to that item. So these two types of systems represent two ways that players will become more invested in games. And microtransactions and monetized games have a number of implications for regulations. We, I think, are facing new challenges in how we represent many of these products and services, what kind of consumer advice we give about the content of certain games, whether they're fairly classified. And I've put an example down there where one label on this game says in-app purchases are between $10 to $59. But of course, these are purchases that can be made endlessly. So there's really no upper limit to how much a player can spend. We're also raising questions about the extent to which players can get refunds, whether there should be age restrictions, what kind of responsible spending measures should be taken in these activities. And if companies are gathering so much data about specific players, and they have access to things like social media accounts, they're in a strong position to be able to identify the people who seem to be overspending and may be more vulnerable of experiencing addiction-like problems. And also standards for operators. So in terms of research, we know that from this large study conducted in the UK by David Zendel and Heather Wardle, that the big spenders on microtransactions tend to be male. They tend to gamble more frequently, and they also tend to endorse many of the problem gambling indicators. In Australia, we have some data about young people conducted recently, and this graph shows that about a third of children aged 8 to 17 years have made in-game purchases. So this has a lot of implications for long-term gameplay and potentially for problem players, making effective interventions for these players if they've spent so much time and invested so much of themselves into these games. In the UK too, we have some data that says that about 1 in 10 young people have played free gambling style social media based games, and about 1 in 10 have also bet on in-game items like the skins that I showed you before online. So how do monetized games and these experiences relate to excessive gaming? Well, problem gaming, as you know, has had quite a history. It was proposed for inclusion in the DSM in 2012 and was added to Section 3 as a condition in need of further study around that time. And more recently, in 2019, gaming disorder is recognised in the International Classification of Diseases. And what's interesting to me when we're talking about microtransactions is how we don't recognise in this definition the financial consequences in an explicit way. Though certainly, if we're talking about people with gaming disorder who are spending a lot of money on these activities, we would certainly be interested in the financial consequences. And the prevalence of problem gaming or gaming disorder, based on our recent meta-analysis, is around 1 to 2%, though there's a lot of variability depending on the region and also the measurement tool. There's also been some research that shows that expenditure on online games is associated with problem gaming. And this is a study that came out of Germany reporting that expenditure on games was positively associated with problem gaming. In one of our recent studies, we surveyed 471 regular gamers, and we were interested in a number of different harms. So harms in their health, harm financially, harm to their work and study and relationships. And we found a linear relationship that as people experienced more problem gaming symptoms, they also tended to report more harms. But also, interestingly, we found that loot box spending was positively related to gaming-related harms. And this was the only type of financial expenditure in games that had that significant relationship. So it seems that there's something about the continuous, random nature of spending money on microtransactions that is correlated with gaming-related harms. So what are some of the public health or other responses to address problem gaming and excessive microtransaction spending? Well, unfortunately, the gaming industry has been quite resistant to the notion of problem gaming, often challenging this in a very public way. This is a video that was uploaded by the Entertainment Software Association a couple of years ago. They've since taken the video down. But in this video, they highlight that gaming really only has positive consequences for players and that any concerns about problem gaming are maybe unfounded. Now, I should say that the gaming addiction research community does not actually dispute that games have benefits. We do acknowledge that gaming does have a number of benefits for a lot of people. However, there are also some people who experience problems, and we're asking for the industry to meet us halfway and recognise this. And the typical industry measures that have been advanced have been things like consumer advice, things like parental controls, which may be effective in some cases. And more recently, this is a public statement from the global gaming industry's organisations and representatives expressing concern that gaming disorder is contained within the WHO's ICD-11. Despite opposition from in their opinion, the medical and scientific community. So what has been done in terms of interventions? We see many of these have been documented in the media. We've had hospital-based approaches. There's a number of different retreats that tend to aim to do what's called a digital detoxification, getting people to spend time away from their digital devices. And there's a great deal of variability in terms of what different countries and jurisdictions are doing in terms of public health measures for problem gaming. Quite a lot has been done in South Korea, and we heard about quite a bit of that from Professor Hae-Kook Lee. And there's also quite a bit being done in China and Japan and also Germany. But there are also significant gaps in terms of research funding, in terms of government support and intervention options in some other countries, including my country, Australia. And here is an example of the Australian Communications and Media Authority in Australia, which published their report on digital lives of young Australians just this year or last month. And there were actually no references at all to any gaming data in this report. And there was no reference to any types of problem gaming. So it's an issue that that doesn't always get the attention that it warrants in some jurisdictions. And this is the advice on the Australian E-Safety Commissioner website about spending time alone, too much time online, effectively saying you should turn off your notifications on your social media, and there are some counselling links. But we don't really in Australia have a systematic and targeted specialist service for responding to problem gaming and these sorts of issues. And people who tend to experience these issues and who might be also spending a lot of money on microtransactions tend to gravitate to general mental health practitioners, or they might go to a gambling help service, but we don't have anything specialised in Australia. So in terms of the treatment evidence, we reviewed this a few years ago. There are over 30 studies that have been done on interventions for problem gaming, and they're quite mixed in terms of their evidence. But I do want to spotlight just one recent randomized controlled trial. I'll skip this. This is just to say that there's only been a few drug studies, and CBT tends to be the main approach. And we don't know much about the long-term gains associated with treatment. And really, there's only been one study that has looked at long-term therapy with follow-up in the area of family therapy. But this is the study I wanted to highlight, which was published last year in JAMA Psychiatry by Klaus Wolfling and their team at the Outpatient Behavioural Addiction Centre in Germany. And they conducted a randomised controlled trial for adult men who experience problem gaming. And this is a 15-session CBT program that has a number of phases, and they conducted a follow-up of outcomes. And what they reported is that many of the adult patients that come to their centre are often very ambivalent about changing their gaming. They're often at this point still very invested, and they don't necessarily want to stop gaming. They just want to try to get it under control. Though the program recommends that they do spend some time without any playing at all, an abstinence period. And what stood out to me in reading their work is that there's a very high dropout, even among people who do seek help or who are supported in seeking help. About a third of them don't finish treatment. And one of the challenges for treatment in this area, for gaming in particular, is that because it takes up so much time for the person who has a problem, over 30 hours a week, they get quite depressed through treatment because gaming has been the main way in which they regulate their emotions, and they need something else to fill the time. So in terms of other potential interventions, we could ask whether or not the industry should be in charge of self-regulating. There is one example here of a company that did recognise that their microtransactions were being overused, and they removed a microtransaction, but we don't have any good evidence at this stage that the industry should be self-regulating. And we wrote a paper a few years ago presenting a social responsibility blueprint so that this could provide the foundation for improving consumer protection measures. And we suggested things like introducing age restrictions on games with microtransactions, helping people to seek refunds on the large purchases or any purchase that they make in a game, because often when you put your money into the game, you can't get it out again. Also helping people to access information about how much they're spending. People shouldn't have to go to their credit card to get access how much they've spent. They should be able to see that within the game itself. Players should also be able to limit their availability or their accessibility to the game by self-excluding. They should be able to spend according to a limit within the game. And within the game too, it may be helpful for some players if they can see how much things actually cost in real world currency, not in the fake currency of the game, like a gem or a diamond or something like that. And also making all purchases within games valuable to the player, so they're not spending money repeatedly on worthless items in the game. And I read a recent report, this is by UNICEF, who have published a more extensive list of considerations and recommendations for the gaming industry, which may be a helpful working document for some companies. There's also been a focus on providing parents with information strategies around setting limits and modelling good use for electronic media use in the house, to helping bring gaming and other digital activities into balance with other life activities. We ran a survey that was published this year about prevention options, and we asked regular gamers what sorts of things they would like to see that might be helpful. And the sorts of things they identified that they would support included things like education and guidelines. And the gamers tended to be more opposed to any kind of measure that would restrict access in the game. So they were much more open to sort of voluntary measures. But there's one thing that we've learned from the gambling field of research, and that's voluntary measures to restrict gambling are far less effective than mandatory ones. That if you want to introduce effective harm reduction measures, it's much more effective if you make these mandatory for all players. And what could this look like for problem gaming? Well, this might be for young people in perhaps early intervention model in secondary school or even primary school, to get these people to think about the strategies and structural designs that the industry use to make them more immersed and engaged with games in ways that can lead to overuse. And getting young people to think critically about many of these games. How does the game change you? How do you know when you're playing too much? What makes a game fun versus problematic? And is the game controlling you more than you are controlling the game? Okay, I've kept to time reasonably well. So I want to return to the summary of my talk that I gave you at the beginning, and I want to expand on it a little bit and talk about some of the implications. So the first implication is that because in-game spending is so common across so many different types of games, including mobile games and other games, one way that would be effective is for the gaming industry to lend its support to academics and share some of the data that it has for us to more effectively study these activities and the psychological effects they have on players. At the moment, researchers are relying very heavily on self-report tools, and they don't have access to the same kinds of information that the industry have. We're just trying to keep up with what the industry is doing. Some microtransactions appear to be quite predatory in nature, and this raises a number of questions around how we can regulate these activities and help protect consumers, while at the same time not dramatically changing these activities in such a way that it would infringe on the enjoyment experience of players who don't experience problems. And this is going to be a challenge going forward for regulation. But currently in some jurisdictions, we simply have very poor regulation, and we rely on things like a simple label on a box to tell people that a game includes microtransactions. There are some game spending behaviours that are very similar to and enable gambling, and we need more research to clarify the links and similarities between these sorts of behaviours and gambling and problem gaming. The game monetisation systems are very different to and more complex than gambling mechanics, as you could see through just some of the design utility patents that have been filed. So we need more conceptual work, I think, to better understand the structural design of the game and how it affects the players, and more specifically, how some of these game features promote greater risk and harm to certain vulnerable players. There's growing research. I've only shown you a handful. There's many studies now that suggest there are correlational links between microtransaction spending and indicators of problem gaming. And we need to look at some of these links and relationships beyond just online samples and gaming samples to look at clinical populations and understand how some of these behaviours and these risks affect their general functioning and other conditions. And finally, in-game spending in some cases can be conceptualised as part of problem gaming and gaming disorder. And there's need for better assessment tools and effective interventions across all levels to help respond to this growing issue. Okay, and with that, I want to say thank you very much for your attention. If you'd like to access any of the papers that we've worked on, you can find them most easily on ResearchGate, and we also have a book on internet gaming disorder that is available online. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Daniel King, for your valuable contribution and amazing presentation. Now, I would like to direct some questions from the audience to you. It's okay for you, right?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, how does purchasing items in games differ according to gender?
Yeah, it's interesting that there are some studies that would suggest that males in general tend to spend more money on certain games, though I suspect that we have to also take into into account the type of game that we're talking about. It's not limited only to males. There's been a number of reports of women as well who are spending a great deal of money on microtransactions. So we're seeing both genders, all genders are spending money on these activities.
Oh, yeah. And another one is, what is the relation between personality traits and buying items in games? Is there any relationship?
Yeah, personality. There are. So if we look at the classic big five personalities of problem gaming and also microtransaction spending, that would suggest that the sorts of people who are more inclined to spend money tend to rate more highly on personality traits like neuroticism, and they also tend to be they might also be more introverted. These sorts of people, but when looking at trait level risk indicators, the number one risk factor that emerges consistently across studies is always impulsivity. People who tend to be more impulsive tend to spend more. That's often the most significant risk factor.
Impulsive shopping in everywhere, huh? Microtransaction and in-game loot boxes.
Yeah, so we've put forward a number of often disguising what the game involves and their chances of acquiring certain items and enticing you with flashy graphics or descriptions like this is the most popular thing that you can buy. But if players have a more accurate and factual information about the transaction at the point of purchase, they may be less inclined to spend $10 or $100 if they know that the chance of getting a million. So this sort of information would be helpful. And we've seen in some jurisdictions, like in China, they've made it mandatory for these this disclosure, the odds always to be reported. But in saying that, even if it's enshrined in regulation, it doesn't necessarily mean it's always implemented in the same way for all games. And there's been some recent analysis that shows that even the games in China that are regulated, they don't always present all the information about the odds of acquiring virtual items. But I think the first thing players need is factual information. So there needs to be more transparency from the industry about these products.
Thank you. And one more thing, it's maybe a little special. You wish something in Istanbul, huh? What was that? If it's not special, huh?
I don't know. I don't know what it was, but if I could wish for something now, it would be that the world can go back to the way it was before 2020.
But you forgot your wishes, huh?
I'm sure I was already enjoying myself, so I couldn't think of anything else to make the experience better.
Okay, I totally understand. Thank you, Mr. King, for your amazing presentation and enlightening answers, and share with us with your wishes.
Thank you very much.
Have a good one, sir. Thank you. And okay, after almost 15-minute recess, today's first and our Congress fourth session will start. I hope see you all at 11 a.m. Bye.